Hi, Deb Boulay, August 29th, the second special education tape. It's my video 16. That's how it'll be labeled in the library for you to click on later if you want to review it. So in the one that I posted about an hour ago, I spoke about the basics of special education so that you understand how if you are new to the system, new to the district, new to any school, you now know how you can apply for early intervention if your child is up to age 3, preschool intervention for services, which is up to kindergarten. And then if you have a student who's a child who is already in the system, kindergarten through grade 12, how you go about soliciting testing to see if your child is eligible for services. I spoke to you about the types of testing, a little bit about what will be done and by whom. Um, Next step is to really get into the types of settings that can be offered to your child. Keep in mind, though, and I'll talk more about what I'm about to say in the third video, there's a process that happens continually. So once your child is placed into the system and put into one of these settings, then every 3 years, your child has to go through what's called a triennial. It's a retesting, it's a revisiting of where your child is at 3 years later. Um, Test scores can change, services can help students. At the end of that 3 year cycle, all parties involved come to the table. So if your child has a speech deficit, it would be the speech teacher, could be an occupational therapist, will be the school psychologist, will be the special ed teacher, a lot of people together to ensure that your child is in the best location. In between, so year two, in between, so first year assigned, second year, that year where there is no testing, work samples are used and information statements from other teachers. So there's always a variety of information to help inform which setting your child needs to be in, what's least restrictive for your child. So now let me explain these settings again in more detail. I have taught in every one of these settings over the course of my career. I consider myself to really be an expert on this, among other things. This is my thing. So I can speak to you from a place of absolute knowledge and absolute experience. At the end of this tape, I'm going to do a role play to show you what has happened to me during one of these meetings when I was representing a student so that you're prepared. If something like this is said to you, you know what to say back to be really clear about where your child is being placed. So here we go. First, the very least restrictive are these things called consultations. I really don't see the benefit of this. It's my personal opinion. If a student has been classified and they're only classified to either have a special education teacher talk to their teachers occasionally or talk to them occasionally, it doesn't make sense to me, and here's why. Teachers, regular ed teachers, special ed teachers, every teacher in the building, every building, knows how to read an IEP, read a 504, knows how to make whatever's on those documents happen in their classroom. They don't need another teacher to say, hey, are you doing what's on there? How's that working out? I mean, to me, it's not useful, but it exists. So again, a direct consult would be that a special education teacher is assigned to speak periodically in whatever time frame is decided to your child to say, hey, Johnny, how's it going? And indirect means they're not talking to your child. Instead, they're saying to the teachers, hey, what's happening? Is everything okay? Do you need anything to be tweaked or changed? So that's the top level. Next, resource room. Let's anchor here a second. A lot of people think that a resource room, they want their child, they read a little bit somewhere about it and say during a meeting, can my child have a resource room? Thinking that the resource room is a study hall. Thinking that their kid can take whatever homework they have assigned or reports they have assigned and bring it to the special ed teacher that's in charge of that resource room and get extra help, like a tutoring kind of thing. That's not the intent of the resource room. What the resource room is intended to do is to work on the goals and objectives that are in a kid's IEP. So let's understand this. I'm going to explain to you in a different tape what the IEP has in it, and some of them are 20 pages long, I kid you not. But one thing that's in there are goals. So, and they don't match curriculum. So let's say your child is in 8th grade, and let's say the curriculum outside of spec ed, what the teacher, special ed teacher and regular ed teacher have to teach your child is algebra. Let's say that's what needs to be taught. So there'll be a whole bunch of things like I talked about in other tapes where you can go to the site, see what your child's going to be taught in any given month for math. Has nothing to do with special education. The IEP goals, the goals that are in the IEP, have to do with deficits or areas that your child has to work on in math. Let's say your child, even though they're learning algebra, can't multiply numbers. A goal could be student will know times tables up to 12 times 12. Student will be able to tell time. Student will add and regroup numbers, 3 columns. So the goals that are in the IEP are not worked on necessarily by the classroom teacher. They're not, because the classroom teacher has to teach whatever's in that curriculum map. So who teaches your kid these objectives? Who works on that? That's where the resource room teacher would come in. The instruction is individualized. If there's up to 5 kids maybe in that resource room teacher would have 5 separate sets of instruction for those kids. They would come and they would start working. He or she teacher would work with, this student, then that student, then this one, go back to this one. That's what the resource room is for. It's not a study hall. Your kid's not going to get extra help for grade level material. Your kid is going to get instruction on the skills that they do not have, that they should have at this level. So your child may be assigned to a resource room. If your child has a resource room, they could also be assigned to another setting, or they could just have the resource room. Depends on the decision of that committee. Next, integrated co-teaching. So this is where there are 2 licensed teachers in the classroom. One is the content area, English, math, social studies, science. So a teacher that is licensed for either English, math, social studies, or science is teaching content along with another teacher in the room who is the special education teacher, who is handling the modifications that are on the IEPs for however many students in that class that are classified as special ed. So the class could have up to 32 kids in it, and there could be 15, 16 who are classified as special education, who could all have different things that have to be done in the classroom. 6 students may need a copy of notes from that class. 2 may need to be retaught. 3 other ones may need to be prompted if they're, let's say, ADHD, attention deficit. All kinds of things could be happening, and all of that is juggled through that special education teacher. But do not be misled about the number of kids in an ICT class. This is going to be my role play at the end of what I have had to experience and had to fight in opposition to for my kids. ICT can have up to 32 kids in it. Next, 15-1. There can be a maximum of 15 students and 1 teacher. This teacher is a special education teacher who also is certified and qualified to teach that content. So there could be on a team a 15-1 teacher for math, one for English, one for social studies, one for science. So in those 4 key areas, there are separate teachers. And then for art and music and foreign language, your child would go with maybe 30 kids in a class. And in those other classes, there is not a special educator. So your child would go from the smaller classroom with the special educator who's also qualified to teach content into a class of 30 something with one teacher not certified in special education for the rest of the classes. That's how that works. 12-1-1, 12 students, one teacher, one teaching assistant. A teaching assistant cannot teach new material. Otherwise, there would be a teacher. A teacher teaches the material initially, and the teaching assistant can reteach under the direction of the teacher or provide reteaching from a prior unit that student needs to remember for the current unit. So the role of the teaching assistant is it's not somebody who goes and makes copies. It's not somebody who takes attendance. It's a full-fledged member of that classroom. Now, a 12-1-1 can look just like a 15-1 in that there's a 12-1-1 teacher for English, a 12-1-1 teacher for math, a 12-1-1 teacher for social studies, a 12-1-1 teacher for science. At Heritage Middle School, which is the one that I just left, that's how it was set up. Each content area has its own teacher. And then again, when they go to foreign language or they go to a library class or they go to music, they are with up to 30 kids. There is no special education teacher. There's just one teacher who probably does not have any certification for special education. That's how that works. And then the other thing, the last one I'm going to talk about is an 8-1-2. These are the kids that are most need the most restrictions. In an 8-1-2, the student is not changing classes. We go back to that 12-1-1. Some schools have the 12-1-1 set up where the student does not change classes. And that's because some of the disabilities of those students prohibit them from being kind of let loose in between classes, that they'll never show up back at class. So it's much better for that student to be anchored in one classroom all day for those 4 core subjects. And then, of course, for the rest, like I said, the music, the library, they're out with however many kids are in those other classes. So 8-1-2, most restrictive, 8 kids maximum, 1 teacher, 2 teaching assistants. I also want to mention here throughout all of these settings, right, there could be students who have their own either teaching assistant assigned to them one-on-one or a teacher's aide assigned to them. So for example, I taught 12-1-1 math last year. There was one class where I had 4 adults in the room with me. And that was because I had a teaching assistant and then other students had one-on-one aides. So it was a lot of help in those classes. There's sometimes where it is just a 12-1-1. So to back up also, who runs the show for special education in the state? Everything runs off of what's called Part 200 regulations. And you at any time can search on Google for New York State Education Department, NYSED, and click Part 200. And it's going to tell you what these settings are about, how the district has to conform and has to provide these settings, even if they don't want to. They have to. And then, of course, there's all the ones that are more restrictive where it's not handled in Newburgh. It's handled at, specialized classes at BOCES or some other outside facility. So now let's talk about a typical meeting. Real important part of this tape, so please listen up. You're sitting in a meeting for your kid, and there is let's rattle them off: a speech and language specialist, maybe an occupational therapist, definitely the school psychologist, because she would or he would do part of the testing that's going to be used as data for this meeting. Certainly the special ed teacher, because that teacher has done the academic testing through a test called Wyatt or Woodcock Johnson, and there are others. But again, part of what makes being a special education teacher so challenging is, besides all of the regular duties for classroom work, like any other teacher, you have to be proficient in all these other things like this testing. So the special ed teacher will be there. There'll also be a regular ed representative that's there. And here's what I have experienced happen. Let's say your child is supposed to be in a 12-1-1 classroom, and that's the decision of the committee. 12 students, one teacher, one teaching assistant. And then the person who's representing the special education department, not the special ed teacher, the chairperson of that meeting, who comes from the special ed department from downtown Newburgh, looks at you, the parent, and says, I've got the perfect setting for Johnny. He will be with 12 students who are classified, and he's going to have 2 teachers. And it's going to be great. Do you agree to that? And you're thinking, probably in your head, wow, 12-1-1. So 12 teachers. I thought that meant 1 teacher, but hey, they just told me there's going to be 2 teachers. And you say, yeah, perfect. Okay, blah, 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 blah. And when school starts the next year, you realize that Johnny is not in a 12-1-1. He's in that integrated co-teaching classroom of 30-something kids. And so you're like, wait a second. Here's what you need to be careful of. If you're in a meeting and somebody says that to you, here's what you say back. You say, wait a second, let me be clear. My Johnny is supposed to be in a 12-1-1. So where you're putting him is in a class where there's only 12 kids in total. There's only like 12 desks. And then there's the 1 teacher, and then there's a teaching assistant. You're not telling me, right, that there'll be 12 classified kids in a classroom of 30, right? Because that's not really a 12-1-1 like legally, right? No, it's not. That's an ICT. So let's be clear. There will only be 11 other human being students in that classroom. And you make sure of that. True story, happened last year in the building that I was in. There used to be an 8-1-2 classroom. I start the year teaching 12-1-1, and I'm like, wait a second, who's this kid? Who's this kid? They disbanded the 8-1-2 classroom, felt that there wasn't enough kids to support paying a teacher for it. So they just put him in 12-1-1. And the parents were calling me like, wait a minute, how many kids are in this class? And I was like, didn't special education call you? And you need your they need your consent. So keep this in mind, parents. Your child cannot be moved without your approval. Now, if you miss these CSE meetings more than once, they can put your child somewhere. You don't ever want to miss one of these meetings. The last thing I want you to throw out to you is that, if you are new to this special education system, you're not a veteran parent, you may very well be at a great disadvantage as you go to a meeting like this. Years ago, every meeting had to have what's called a parent advocate. There was somebody there to represent you, the parent, because it was understood that you're not going to understand everything that's being said, or the little, like when they use acronyms, initials for things. How are you supposed to know what that means? You need somebody kind of like a lawyer in a way to represent you, to say, wait, this is what they mean. Do you understand? I have not seen a parent advocate at a meeting in years. So if you are leery or apprehensive or feel that you're not qualified to do this by yourself, ask the district for a parent advocate. I'm actually thinking of doing that in retirement as a give back to the community, to parents who have no other resource, that I would show up with you and tell you exactly, interpret what it is they're saying to you so that you make the best choice for your kid. All right, so those are settings. See you soon.